So good morning, everyone. Thank you for the invitation to talk at the conference today. So my name is Malcolm Brodlie. I work as a clinical academic in paediatric respiratory medicine in Newcastle. As you can see by the backdrop, it's sometimes sunny in Newcastle, but not that often. And I'm really talking today because one of my roles is director of the Northeast NIHR Integrated Academic Training Programme. And the title of the talk, which I hope will last about 20 minutes, is thinking about the next steps beyond being an academic foundation programme doctor. So what I'm planning to cover is, first of all, probably asking you guys some questions as to why would you want to do academic medicine? Talk about some of the options if that is what you want to do. Perhaps spend more time then specifically talking about the NIHR Integrated Academic Training Pathway, and specifically what's most relevant to people at your stage is the academic clinical fellow stage. So the next step would be to be an ACF. I thought it was important to talk a little bit about steps towards the end of being an ACF around doing a PhD and trying to get external fellowships to fund doing a PhD. And then finally, just briefly, I'll talk about the next steps after that even. So why bother with research or academic medicine is a really important question. Hopefully, because you're tuning in to listen to this today on a Saturday, you're actually quite motivated around that question. And I think research or clinical academia or both mean different things to different people. You can probably all recognise the different things mentioned here, everything from papers to presentations to quality improvement audits. But I think what probably drives and hopefully drives most of us is around improving clinical outcomes, so improving outcomes for patients. So why do research? This is a slightly older slide, and it isn't necessarily about identifying new things. It can be about working out how not to treat people, and there's several good examples here. I was preparing this, I thought it really needs updated with the latest, and obviously hydroxychloroquine is a really good example of this around COVID-19. As mentioned, I'm a paediatrician, so here's just some more evidence for you from the paediatric world of the sort of impact that clinical research has had on outcomes for patients. So this graph here is showing the improvement in infant mortality relating to respiratory distress syndrome, basically with the introduction of surfactant. And you can see that that is a dramatic drop that happened with that intervention. And coming back to COVID-19, trying to make it a little bit more relevant to today, clearly these results around dexamethasone from the recovery study are perhaps some of the most widely published and publicised clinical research results of our time, really, but incredibly important at this moment in time. If you think a little bit more broadly as well, there's really quite a substantial body of evidence now showing that hospitals that have an active research culture, departments that enroll patients into studies, actually have improved outcomes. And you can show that not only for patients who've actually specifically taken part in studies, but simply by being treated in a centre and not necessarily being part of a study yourself, those improved outcomes are transferred even to those patients. And this is just one quite well-known example in colorectal cancer. So if we start to think a little bit more personally about why you, and the way I look at it is that most importantly, you can only do research if you're inspired by it, if you're interested in it, if you think the questions that you're trying to answer are important. Because inevitably, it's going to involve a huge amount of hard work, as you probably found already during your academic foundation posts. And it may be 90% perspiration and 10% inspiration, but you've got to enjoy what you're doing. Otherwise, you're just not going to find the energy put in those hours, to put in that hard work. So this is a purposefully out-of-date slide. And this was perhaps the idealistic pathway that people who were going to become clinical academics were meant to take. You can see how out of date it is because we obviously no longer have SHOs or SPRs. But this was, in theory, the pathway that you were meant to take. The reality was often very different. And rather than that nice, steady staircase of career progression, it often felt more like a sheer rock face that you were trying to climb. And it is true that there are plenty of different routes that can be taken to reach the same point. Just important that everyone remembers that. What is a really positive thing, undoubtedly, is the NIHR integrated pathway, though. So as I mentioned, those previous slides were purposefully out of date, and now there is a much more clear and resourced clinical academic training pathway. And I would guess that, being a motivated audience, you're probably all fairly well aware of this. So I'm just going to quickly run over it over the next couple of slides. This is a medical audience, but obviously the NIHR is not just about medics. So it's about a multidisciplinary approach to try and increase a culture of clinical research in the country. And here you can see a particular mention of the fellowships and pathway relevant to doctors and dentists. This is it in a bit more detail. You're obviously all at this stage, the academic foundation programme, with the obvious next step in that pathway being academic clinical fellowships or ACFs. So I've taken a few slides, these are generic NIHR slides, but they're quite important and summarise the background probably far better than I could in my own slides. So each year, NIHR fund about 250 ACF posts and also 100 clinical lecturer posts, which I'll briefly mention at the end. Importantly, from your point of view, they are administered and appointed to on a regional basis via a grouping of medical schools, so-called deaneries or higher education groupings, medical education groupings, and also linked NHS trusts as well, the so-called IAT partnerships. The actual posts themselves, I wouldn't worry too much about this, but the way that they are allocated on a national basis to each region can either be via a formula or a competition system. So effectively there's a bidding process that goes on. So not every region may not have exactly the same number of posts or even the same specialty of posts available. And this is partly worked out by a competitive bidding process, and then there are other metrics involved like NIHR funding that each region may have attracted, etc. As mentioned on the final bullet point there are also key priority research themes, and some posts can be linked to a theme. And these are the current priority areas as identified by NIHR. And I guess the idea behind this is to try and encourage young academics to move into these particular areas of need. And these will obviously change with time. So I think you're all probably listening to this to hear about ACF posts. So the short summary is that they last for 3 years. They give an academic split of 25%. So that means that 75% of the time is spent doing clinical training, but a quarter of the time is spent in academic-based work. And this can vary in different regions, and there's probably less flexibility than there is around clinical lecturer posts, but there can be some flexibility exactly what's done and how it's done. Importantly, they're obviously specialty specific in terms of the clinical specialty, and they're applied to and allocated on that basis. And the usual or expected outcome is to, at the end of an ACF, then attract funding for, ideally from an external fellowship, to then undertake a PhD or MD. So quite a lot of the time during an ACF post may be about trying to improve your CV to make yourself competitive for these sort of applications, to generate pilot data for these fellowship applications, and hopefully also generate publications, but all working up towards this target really. It is possible to apply for an ACF post if you happen to have already done a PhD, and I can think of several people in my region that have done that. And obviously, as mentioned about the different paths, you don't absolutely have to go on to do a PhD. And I think I'm correct in saying that a run-through clinical training post still follows with an individual if they choose to do that rather than undertake a PhD. Really importantly, they're normally advertised in October each year. There was quite a bit of uncertainty this year around COVID and what was going to happen, but my understanding is they will be advertised potentially next week on the 1st of October nationally. So if you're interested in at that stage, you need to be looking out for adverts in the next couple of weeks. This is just to show you that NIHR have a lot of information on their website. This page gives you details of the program leads for each region. So this is me here. And that also reminds me to say, the next couple of slides I've taken from my colleague, John Sayer, and they talk a little bit specifically about the ACF program in the Northeast, but are relevant to most other programs as well. So just by way of illustration of the sort of broad range of specialty posts that are available, all of these have been available in recent years in the Northeast, and it's similar in most regions. You can see mention of themes here as well. And in all regions, there's some form of teaching attached to being an ACF as well. So for example, in the Northeast, there's a program that leads to the award of a postgraduate certificate in clinical research. And this is regarded as something that has to be done. And it teaches generic skills about research governance and ethics, study design and data interpretation, communication and education in research. And this is done via a day release system and some online learning as well. What does research time give you? What does an ACF post give? So crucially, it's time to think, time to read, time to write, away from a clinical area, away from having your bleep or DEX phone going, to try and develop those ideas, as I mentioned. It can give you time to visit local research groups, even external research groups. Each post comes with a bursary that can be used for travel to conferences, but it could just be collaborative visits. And it lets you obtain pilot data and build up your CV. And I think crucial to these posts are the academic supervisors as well. Clearly this is someone who's separate from your clinical supervisor, but really important that you have an appropriate supervisor or group of supervisors to provide that mentorship, that guidance, and to help you at this stage of training. And I think it's having someone that you can work with is obviously crucial. And part of their job is to develop with each trainee an academic training program and realistic set of goals and targets. So I've put in a few slides next from other talks that I've done about external PhD fellowships, because as mentioned, that's really one of the key sort of targets at the end of an ACF and what you should be working towards. They also crop up again later on with so-called intermediate fellowships, but we're going to talk about PhD fellowships today. So a number of funding bodies offer these sort of fellowships. Some of these websites are a little bit out of date, as you can see, but there obviously are MRC, Wellcome, this is NIHR, who have their own fellowships, and I have a slide coming up on that, and Wellcome as well. Wellcome have changed their model, and often these are now administered on a regional basis. And importantly, a fair few charities and offer disease-specific fellowships as well. There's a lot of advantages to having an external clinical fellowship to fund a PhD. The amount of money offered tends to be enough to fund the work correctly. They're seen as prestigious things to have, can bring allied opportunities, other training opportunities, networking opportunities, etc. And as a trainee, it arguably gives you a certain amount of independence because it's your fellowship. There are some downsides in that these awards can be competitive. So putting in that hard work to develop an application is just absolutely required. And you could argue they're dependent on track record and CV, as we've talked about, and they often involve an interview and can be a lengthy process. Some work's been done. I think these were holders of an MRC training fellowship, and work's been done to show by having one of these, most people actually go on to an academic career and or hold senior clinical positions. So the outcomes are actually fantastic for people who have training fellowships. I mentioned that NHR have fellowships as well, and this slide is only in here just to point out to you that some aspects of their scheme have changed recently, but certainly there are doctoral fellowships available, and full details on the website. So to develop a fellowship application, I think you need all of these aspects. You clearly need the inspiration, you need that idea. It's helpful if that idea plays into a narrative around the disease that you're interested in. It can be a story about you and your career as well, because after all, this is about training. It's helpful to have supportive preliminary data and support in the broadest sense in terms of supervisors, institutional support as well. I think it takes time to prepare these things. There are different aspects to the application process and different audiences at the different stages that you need to win over. So first of all, you've got to be eligible to be able to apply. Applications tend to be reviewed then by external peer reviewers. So these will logically be experts in that particular area. So they need to be impressed by the project and think that it makes sense and is deliverable. And then often there's actually an interview stage as well for people that are shortlisted. And that is a much more general panel of experts. So you've got to be able to sell the project to that kind of audience and be able to answer their questions. The mantra being that the person, project and place are all being assessed. In the next few slides, I'll just talk briefly about each of those aspects. So as mentioned, the project is obviously very important, and that first stage of review, I think, is often about the project. Traditionally, these sort of applications will be hypothesis-driven projects that have to be both novel but deliverable as well for a PhD. Helpful if you have preliminary data, and it's certainly crucial to have a logical experimental plan that isn't all predicated on just one experiment. The person, because this is obviously something that you need to be thinking about now. So I'm sure you're all enthusiastic people because you're choosing to listen to this. But working on that CV in terms of publications, presentations, relevant experience, all really important. Having supportive references that clearly show that those people know you as an individual, I think, can only help as well. And try and articulate where that fellowship will take you. You need a supportive and appropriate team that have that track record, that have the time, though, to be able to put the time into you as well. And clearly the wider environment and training environment are very important as well. So what happens after you've successfully completed your PhD? So obviously now, at this stage, and the next obvious step is a clinical lecturer post. So these posts, in brief, last for 4 years, often through to CCT. And they truly give a 50-50 split between academic work and clinical training, leading up to commonly for applications for intermediate fellowships. And CL posts give genuine flexibility about how that time is spent. So just to summarize, hopefully, what I've gone through, perhaps really and most importantly, choose to do what you enjoy. Inevitably, it's going to be hard work and you have to persevere with it. I would strongly recommend a career as a clinical academic though, because I think that the pros outweigh the cons. So the advantages being that independence, that it can be enjoyable, stimulating and flexible. Inevitably it's hard work, and there is a balance there with clinical work, with family life, for example, but it's possible to achieve that balance. I should acknowledge, as I mentioned, John Sayer and NHR for some of those slides. I think there's a chance to ask questions as part of the panel. Also would be happy for anyone to contact me, especially if you may be interested in applying for ACF posts in the North East. Thank you for listening.
Hi, so my name's Zaid. I am an F1 in West London, and I just completed the Medics Academy Training in Teaching Day 3 course.
I think it's structured in a really nice way with a lot of resources you can permanently access. The course isn't over after 3 days. You've got a ton of online content that you can always revisit, and I think that is fantastic.
I thought it was a great way to learn through having a full day at the start and then 2 later days of self-study. It really allowed for flexibility and allowed us to fully engage in the course.
It also made me feel better prepared to deliver teaching remotely or digitally.
It's really interactive. There's a lot of small group feedback session, exchanging ideas and learning people's perspective.
After actually doing this course, I realised that teaching is more of a science, and it's really important to get clear feedback so that you can improve your teaching.
This course also encouraged me to think thoroughly about what my audience actually wants from my teaching session, and also how I can keep them better engaged.
Really great and fantastic to get such fantastic lectures from experts in the field throughout the 3 days. It was also interesting to learn from others taking part on the course, because we all have different levels of experience, so it was interesting to gain their perspective on things too.
I learned not just about a different style of teaching, I also learned about what is medical education, how to build a career in medical education.
Overall, I learned a lot from the teaching course.
I think it's a really well done course.
I really enjoyed it.
And I really found it very enjoyable.
That's what I thought of the whole course, and I really enjoyed it, and I would recommend it to other people.
So thank you for letting me participate.